A boy was digging at the edge of the garden when he saw a big toe. He tried to pick it up, but it was stuck to something. He gave it a good hard jerk, and it came off in his hand. Then he heard something groan and scamper away. The boy took the toe into the kitchen and showed it to his mother. "It looks nice and plump," she said. "I'll put it into the soup and we'll have it for supper." That night, his father carved the toe into 3 pieces, and they each had a piece. Then they did the dishes, and when it got dark, they went to bed. The boy fell asleep almost at once, but in the middle of the night, a sound awakened him. It was something out in the street. It was a voice, and it was calling to him. "Where is my toe?" It groaned. When the boy heard that, he got very scared, but he thought, "It doesn't know where I am. It will never find me." Then he heard the voice once more, only now it was closer. "Where is my toe?" It groaned. The boy pulled the blankets over his head and closed his eyes. "I'll go to sleep," he thought. "When I wake up, it'll be gone." But soon he heard the back door open, and again he heard the voice. "Where is my toe?" It groaned. Then the boy heard footsteps move through the kitchen into the dining room, into the living room, into the front hall. Then slowly they climbed the stairs. Closer and closer they came. Soon they were in the upstairs hall. Now they were outside his door. "Where is my toe?" the voice groaned. His door opened. Shaking with fear, he listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark toward his bed. Then they stopped. "Where is my toe?" the voice groaned. "You've got it!"
Some say this rhyme doesn't mean anything. Others are not so sure. There was a man who lived in Leeds. He filled his garden full of seeds. And when the seeds began to grow, it was like a garden filled with snow. And when the snow began to melt, it was like a ship without a belt. And when the ship began to sail, it was like a bird without a tail. And when the bird began to fly, it was like an eagle in the sky. And when the sky began to roar, it was like a lion at my door. And when the door began to crack, it was like a penknife in my back. And when my back began to bleed, I was dead, 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 indeed.
There was a young woman who married a man from the south. They lived together in a small cabin by the river. The pair got along pretty well, and they had 2 little boys. The woman only had one problem. Her husband was always going out at night. Sometimes he would be gone for hours, and sometimes he would stay out all night. He would always go swimming in the river, and the darker it was, the better he liked it, because he could see at night, just like an owl. As soon as the boys were big enough to walk, he took them swimming with him. They would stay in the river all night long, and the woman had to sleep at home by herself. After a while, the woman started acting very strange. She told the neighbors that her husband was turning into an alligator, and he was trying to turn their little boys into alligators too. Something has to be done about it, she said. The neighbors thought the woman was losing her mind. They told her it was normal for boys to go swimming with their father, and everybody knew there weren't any alligators in that part of the country. Finally, one Sunday morning, the woman came running into town. Her clothes were soaking wet, and she told the preacher that a big alligator and 2 little alligators had pulled her into the river. She said they were trying to make her live in the river and forcing her to eat raw fish. She claimed it was her husband and her 2 little boys, and they were trying to turn her into an alligator too, but she broke loose and managed to crawl out onto the bank. It all sounded so crazy that the townspeople took the woman to the doctor. They were afraid she might hurt herself in some way. They could hear her hollering all over town, until the doctor gave her an injection to knock her out. The sheriff went out to the cabin by the river, but there was nobody there. About a week after that, the doctor sent the woman to a mental institution, and she never came back. Her husband and the 2 little boys never showed up again either, and to this day, nobody knows what became of them. For years after that, hunters and fishermen would see alligators in the river on moonlit nights. They said there was always 1 big alligator and 2 little ones, but nobody believed them. Everybody knows there aren't any alligators in this part of the country.
The Guests is a scary story about a young couple who spend the night in a strange old house. It's based on an old folklore, and a version of this story appeared in the book Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. The Guests. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper. They had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. They decided to look for a place to stay overnight and would go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. Maybe they rent rooms, the wife said, so they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee, brought out some cake, and the 4 of them talked for a while. Then, the young couple were taken to their room. They explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said that he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their hosts had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. They then went on to the next town. They stopped at a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground 10 years ago. The old man and woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house. Only, now there was no house. All they found was a burned-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. Then, the woman started screaming. In the rubble, there was a badly burned table, and on the table was the envelope they had left there that morning.
There was a young woman who had just started a new job in a large office building. She was walking to work one day when a long black hearse drove up slowly next to her, matching her pace. This made her nervous, and she anxiously watched it out of the corner of her eye. The driver leaned out the window and called to her in a deep, booming voice. "Do you need a lift?" She turned to look at him and got a terrible shock. The driver's face was incredibly hideous and deformed. His skin was a deathly pale, and one of his eyes was noticeably higher than the other. The man pointed to the rear of the vehicle, which contained a coffin. "Room for one more," he said. Frightened by his bizarre appearance and unwelcome suggestion, she refused his offer of a lift. Profoundly disturbed, the woman ran down the street until she came to the office building where she worked. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange man in the hearse, and was glad when work was finally over. The woman worked up on the 9th floor, and when the elevator came, it was almost completely full. She hesitated a moment before stepping in. "Are you sure you don't want to come in?" asked a familiar, booming voice. "There's room for one more." The woman gasped. It was the hearse driver from this morning, eyeing her with his lopsided, horrible gaze. Now thoroughly spooked, the woman backed away, stuttering. I think I'll take the stairs." The hearse driver just stared at her as the doors slid closed. The woman had only taken a few steps down the stairs when she heard a chorus of screams, followed by a deafening crash. She hurried downstairs and discovered the elevator cable had broken, and all the passengers aboard had plunged to a grisly death.
One night, in a small American town, a young girl threw a party and invited all her friends from school. There was a large group of boys and girls, and, as the night went on, they began telling scary stories. One boy said he had heard an urban legend about an old graveyard that was located near the girl's house. According to the story, an old woman had been buried in the middle of the cemetery, and there were rumors that she was a witch. They said that if someone stood on her grave at midnight, she would grab them and drag them down to hell. "I would never go near that graveyard after dark," another boy said. "You're a bunch of morons," laughed the girl who owned the house. "It's a silly superstition. I can't believe you take it seriously." The boy who had told the story turned to her and sneered. "It's all very well to be brave when you're safe and warm in your own house. I think you'd have a different attitude if you actually went to the graveyard." "It wouldn't make a difference," replied the girl haughtily. "Okay, then prove it," said the boy. "We'll all go down to the cemetery and wait outside while you go in and stand on the old witch's grave." "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." "You'll have to prove you really did it," said the boy. "Otherwise, you might chicken out." He took a knife from the kitchen drawer and handed it to her. "Stick this knife in the grave," he said. "Then we'll know you were there for sure." The group of kids set out for the graveyard, and when they reached the old iron gates, they gathered in a circle. All of them stared at the girl. She tried to pretend she wasn't scared, and she hoped they didn't see her shivering in fear. With the knife clutched tightly in her hand, the girl walked through the old iron gateway and made her way through the darkened graveyard. In the moonlight, the tombstones and the trees cast strange and unnerving shadows. Eventually, She came to the old woman's grave. "There's nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself. "It's just a stupid story." Clutching in front of the headstone, she whispered, "I'm not afraid of you." Then she raised the knife above her head and thrust it into the earth. "Take that, you old witch," she chuckled. The girl was about to turn and leave when she felt something holding her back. She couldn't move. Something was tugging on the hem of her dress and dragging her down. She was filled with terror and flew into a panic. "Help!" she cried. "She's got me! She's got me!" When she didn't come back, her friends began to get worried. After a while, they cautiously entered the graveyard to look for her. They found her, sprawled across the old woman's grave. She was dead, and her face frozen in a silent scream. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had it pinned to the ground. That was what had been holding her. The poor girl had been so terrified that her heart gave in, and she died of fright.
In the mountains of West Virginia, there is a little place called French Creek. Many years ago, a man by the name of Bill Williams lived there. He was tall and slim and worked as a butcher. At that time, West Virginia had a problem. The timber wolves in the area had gone out of hand. They were killing cattle and sheep, and the farmers couldn't stop them. The state of West Virginia put a bounty on wolves. They said they would pay hunters $10 for every wolf pellet they turn in. Bill Williams thought that was pretty good money, so he gave up his job as a butcher and turned his attention into hunting wolves. As it turned out, he was very good at it. Every year, he managed to kill over 500 wolves at a bounty of $10 per pellet. That came over $5,000, which was a huge amount of money in those days. After 5 years of this, Bill had killed so many wolves that there were barely any left in the area. They were almost becoming extinct, and the few that were left were smart enough to stay hidden. So Bill decided to retire. He said the wolves had made him rich, so he swore that he would never harm one again. Every day, he just sat in a local house chewing tobacco, whittling on a piece of wood, and telling tall tales about his hunting expeditions to anyone who would listen. Everything went well for a few years. Then one day, a farmer burst into the store. He said that a white wolf had killed 2 of his sheep. He claimed he managed to get a shot out of the wolf and hit it 3 times, but the bullets didn't have any effect to it. Soon, other farmers had begun spotting the white wolf all over the countryside, killing their livestock. They shot at it, but no matter how many times they hit the wolf, nothing seems to stop it. The people begged Bill to do something about it, but he refused. The white wolf went on killing, and it seemed that nothing was safe. The bloody, half-eaten corpse of cows and sheep littered the countryside. Then, one night, the wolf came to Bill's yard and killed his pet cow. Bill was so angry that he forgot about his promise to never harm another wolf. He swore he would get revenge, and the next morning, he went out and bought a young lamb to use as bait. He took it out into the hills and tied it to a tree. Then, he backed off about 50 yards and hid behind another tree. With his shotgun on his lap, he sat there and lay in wait. After a few days, when Bill didn't return, the people in town went looking for him. Finally, they came across the young lamb. It was still tied to the tree and seemed to be unharmed. Then they spotted Bill. He was slumped against the other tree, but he was dead. His throat has been torn open. There were no signs of struggle. His gun hadn't been fired, and there was no tracks in the soil around him. As for the white wolf, it was never seen again. But some people say when the moon is full, You can still hear the howling.
Cold as Clay, narrated by Furberries. A farmer had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named Jim, but the farmer didn't think Jim was good enough for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the country. Soon after she left, Jim got sick, and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart. The farmer felt so guilty about Jim's death, he could not tell his daughter what had happened. She continued to think about Jim and the life they might have together. One night many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, Jim was standing there. "Your father asked me to get you," he said. "I came on his best horse." "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. Soon he complained of a headache. "It aches something terrible," he told her. She put her hand on his forehead. "Why, you are as cold as clay," she said. "I hope you are not ill," and she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they reached the farm. The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. "Didn't you send for me?" she asked. "No, I didn't," he said. She turned to Jim, but he was gone, and so was the horse. They went to the stable to look for them. The horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of Jim. Terrified, her father told her the truth about Jim's death. They quickly went to see Jim's parents. They decided to open his grave. The corpse was in its coffin, but around its head they found the girl's handkerchief.
Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near the post office talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Surprisingly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark, it was hard to tell for sure. As quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. But soon it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then turned around and returned to the field. Then it came for a third time and started towards them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared and they started running. But when they finally stopped, they decided they were being silly and childish. They weren't so sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon, they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white t-shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm going to try and touch it, then we'll know if it's real." He courageously walked up to it and peered into its face. It had bright, penetrating eyes that sunk deep into its head. It looked almost like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and again he and Sam ran, but the corpse-like figure followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it, appalled. It stayed out in the road for a while, seeming to watch them in return, but once more, it vanished. No more than a year later, Ted grew horribly ill, and the sickness killed him. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. The night Ted died, he looked just like the frightening thing that they had encountered a year before.
One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in a settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp. He sat there reading the Bible. Then just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept getting closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, step, 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 up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited and waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly, step, 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 step closer and closer, step, step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face so he could see the bones and parts of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said,
"If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church."
The haunt sobbed, like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor. It was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. He confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearthrug. He did, and he found a big sack of money. And where that haunt had held onto his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. Real quick before I end this video, I want to take the time to thank the narrators who took part in this video. They were amazing. I just love their submissions, and I do plan on doing a video series on these books, and I do plan to have other people on. I would say this first video is a great success because I had a lot of fun putting it together, and these narrators really put their all into this, and I'm really thankful for that. So I just want to take the time to thank Raven, Lady Spookaria, Horror of Yig, Phoenix Fire, Furberries, Nathaniel Nelson, Dodge of the Grave, Danny Dreadful, Silver Underworld, just all of you guys. I hope I listed everybody. If not, I apologize, I really do. And yeah, I look forward to doing more videos like this and just collaborating more because I love collaborating. It's great. And I love these books. Some of my very first videos on YouTube ever were Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. They've stuck with me for years, and I feel like it should be a part of every horror-seeking kid's childhoods, because it really delivers. So, yeah, I just want to take the time to thank everybody who helped out, and, of course, thank you guys for subscribing to my channel. And I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to look at my links in the description. You'll see like links to my other YouTube channels. I have YouTube channels for different things. I have all my social media down there, and I have my Patreon if you want to financially support the channel. And there's also some exclusive content if you want to donate for that. That's all I have to say. There's my outro.